Good evening. I have the great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker to you, and I will first say something about his background for those who haven't visited his website, and then make a few comments surrounding his topic, and then hand over to Michael. Michael Wesley, as you have heard, is the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy. Previously, he was Professor of International Relations and Director of the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University, and a visiting fellow at the University of Hong Kong and Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, China. Prior to this, he was Assistant Director General for Transnational Issues at the Office of National Assessment and a Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the University of New South Wales. Between 2007 and 2009, Michael was the editor of the Australian Journal of International Affairs and chief investigators in the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence in Policing and Security. He has served on the Australian Research Council's College of Experts and the Queensland's Art Gallery Board of Trustees. And in April 2008, he was co-chair with Foreign Minister Stephen Smith of one of the 10 issue streams at the Australian Government 2020 Summit and gave the keynote speech at the summit. His most recent books are Energy Security in Asia, The Howard Paradox, Australian Diplomacy in Asia, and Making Australian Foreign Policy. So Michael is one of our top experts on foreign policy. His topic tonight, Getting China Right, is timely because getting China right suddenly seems difficult. The defence paper, Chinalco, Rio Tinto, Sternhall, Kadir are all stations on the way to making China a difficult topic and making it controversial. There are a few major dimensions. There's a security dimension, and people will have seen in the City Morning Herald this morning an article by Peter Harcher, who is also a fellow at the Lowy Institute. US panic at China's new ship killer, which is an article on the threatening new missiles that are being developed in China to destroy American, presumably, aircraft carriers. It takes a while to figure out that the analyst who Peter Harcher quotes only thinks that it is prudent to expect such missiles to be operating within a couple of years. That is, they're very much concept missiles, but it's presented as something that puts pressure on Taiwan, that puts pressure on the military situation and the stability at the moment in the region and in the end on us. Hugh White, on the other side, argues that the current regional order is about to change, but that there's nothing illegitimate or threatening in the fact that China growth will challenge the US primacy in Asia. And he says, we do not know what kind of new order will emerge. He also states that there's no reason to assume that US primacy will simply be replaced by Chinese primacy. So in the security dimension, we have clearly very different views and a need to think where things will go. The economic domain is similarly controversial. We have on the one side the situation where we know that we were taken or helped out of the global crisis very much with the demand for resources that came from China. On the other side, there's growing skepticism about the Chinese investment by state-controlled firms in Australia. That's the one side. On the other side, if you had gone to or had a chance to go to the Australia-China Investment Forum last week, you would have heard that the director of the Foreign Investment Review Board made clear that a large majority of Chinese investment applications are approved. And you would have heard that on the Chinese side, one of the people who came in from Beijing were quite clear in stating that, in fact, they didn't have a clue really what form of investment they should take, nor that they actually know or that they are confident that their foreign investment and takeovers and so on are economically beneficial to them. So again, here you have different views where things will go. There's a value dimension. There's a dimension of sovereignty quite strongly. Best examples are Sternhall and the Chinese intervention in the Melbourne Film Festival with a film by Kadir. The question is not in this case really whether this is acceptable or not. It is not acceptable. The question then becomes one on how to deal with this. And there, of course, we come to the media, which reflect all these tensions that we are observing with China, where on the very superficial level you could argue it's domestic politics. And people do raise the entertaining question whether prime ministers who are illiterate in Chinese might be better in dealing with China. The question then is, where it comes to in the end, from kind of the current debate, whether it's a question of pragmatic action, quiet diplomacy, whether in fact things can go on, which is clearly one view, and on the other side the question whether in fact we do need a grand plan and whether we have to rethink our involvement with China in a larger context. One of the examples on that side is Stephen Fitzgerald, who recently in an article argued that there should be a new state policy, a foreign policy, or a China white paper, that there should be a China statement by the Prime Minister, that DFAT should be strengthened, that there should be a $25 million research institute, presumably ANU, endowed to study China, as we have here in Sydney with the US Study Centre. So this is all an area which is quite complex. Much of it will depend not only on what we do, but very much on what we think of China, how we look at China, and whether in fact we are understanding in China in a way that means we are getting it right. And I think these are the rough strokes to sketch out the minefield that Michael will lead us through tonight. So I'll pass over to you, Michael.
Hans, many thanks for your kind introduction. In a lot of ways, it's strangely inappropriate that you are introducing me to give a lecture on China. In a lot of ways, I should be introducing you to give a lecture on China, and I think your remarks, your acute remarks, demonstrate exactly what I mean. When China became our largest trading partner 2 years ago, Australia entered uncharted waters. For the first time in our history, our largest trading partner is not a member of our alliance system. For the first time in our history, our largest trading partner is our closest ally's strategic competitor. For the first time in our history, our largest trading partner is not a democracy. With each passing month, the Sino-Australian relationship becomes more complex and difficult to manage as the strands of the relationship become contradictory and tangled. Canberra, it seems, has a schizophrenic attitude to China's rise. Happy at our windfall gains in the short term, but worried over the longer term about China as a great power. In this country, we have traditionally believed that three considerations should drive our foreign policy: our security, our prosperity, and our interests, and our values. With the growing centrality of China to our international affairs, each of these three underpinnings of our foreign policy seems to be pulling in different and contradictory directions. While Canberra and Beijing agree that stability in our region is the best guarantee of our security, they disagree on the methods. We would prefer the United States to be the main guarantor of regional and global security, a preference with which the Chinese disagree. When push comes to shove, our security preferences are going to be different from Beijing's. Our prosperity, however, demands that we are attentive to China's economic wishes. The customer is always right, right? For the decades to come, the demand in China and other large developing countries for our resources, energy and education exports will provide a vital buoyancy to our economy. But even our prosperity interests in relation to China are more complex on closer inspection. Beijing has a preference for acquiring equity stakes in resource producers in the interests of price stability and long-term supply security. Many of the companies doing the buying are state-owned enterprises, and some Australians are uncomfortable about selling our interests, selling our resources to interests linked to the Chinese state. Our values are also likely to be challenged by China. Beijing's neuralgia about travelling dissidents from the Dalai Lama to Falun Gong have shown that it does not accept the validity of democratic freedoms in other countries when they are seen to cut across China's interests. China has shown over time a willingness to manipulate bilateral relationships to discipline errant partners. Australia can no longer muddle through its relationship with China. The chill in Sino-Australian relations this year has drawn timely attention to the need to get Australia's relationship with China right. This is important beyond the bilateral relationship. It is a test of whether Australia has the ability to look after its interests in the coming world, a world in which our international fortunes will not be solely determined by countries that are culturally similar to us. What is required is a fundamental re-examination of this country's vital interests and a clear prioritisation of the values that underpin our foreign policy. We also need to develop a clear idea of how our international environment will evolve over the next decades and where we can fit into this milieu. Getting China right means Australia must make the effort to better understand China, to locate where its interests lie in the context of China's rise, and to articulate its position clearly to Beijing, firmly but non-confrontationally. My friend Clinton Dines, an Australian who has lived and worked in China for 30 years, calls this approach empathy. Empathy lies at the midpoint between sympathy and cold self-interest. An attitude of complete sympathy to China will lead to Australia being exploited. An attitude of pure cold self-interest will harden gradually into mutual antagonism. But an attitude of empathy brings with it a genuine determination to try and understand the situation of the other party. With that understanding comes a clearer appreciation of how the other party's situation affects one's own. With that understanding comes a more realistic appraisal of where one's own interests coincide or clash with those of the other side. And with that understanding comes a more nuanced calculation of what compromises, requests, demands and démarches are likely to work and not to work. To repeat, empathy is an act of two movements. The first is the act of understanding the other's situation. The second is the process of discovering one's own interests, how they are affected by the other party, and deciding which can be compromised and which must be held onto firmly. The bad news is that both of empathy's movements are really hard in relation to China and its rise. Arguably, that's why we don't seem to have a clear, coherent policy in relation to China at the moment. To start with, China defies easy understanding. It is a country that evokes extremes of opinion. People tend to make simple, sweeping judgments about China because it is huge, complex and changing rapidly. It is a country of confounding contradictions. To start with, it is an authoritarian state in which no one exercises clear, uncontested authority. Power and resources in China are far more fragmented among competing authorities than in Australia and arguably even the United States. Lucian Pye, many years ago, captured the two contradictory impulses that lie at the heart of Chinese politics. On the one hand, the urge towards consensus and conformity, but on the other, a search for security and advantage in particularistic patronage relationships which produce an inherent factionalism in Chinese politics. The only route to power, advantage and authority in China lies through joining a policy clique, a group of people with a common interest in the welfare and influence of each other. The fortunes of each member of a policy clique rise and fall together. Throughout the Chinese system of government, preferment, power and succession are determined by complex bargaining among these factions. The rigid division of bureaucratic authority and resources is fundamental to the Chinese system of government. It is a governmental system that is constructed to produce competing interests which jealously guard their authority for specific responsibilities and which compete ruthlessly for resources. A further division of power occurs between the national government in Beijing and the provinces. The reform era has, if anything, significantly increased the resources and power of the provinces vis-à-vis Beijing. Between Beijing and the provinces, there is a constant struggle for authority, resources, and the apportioning of blame for failures in governance. Ultimately, national and provincial governments each have resources and authority that each other needs, and so are codependent. But this does not make the rivalry any less intense. The reform era has thrown powerful, entrepreneurial and cashed-up state-owned companies into the mix. Over all of this divided authority, the Communist Party is supposed to provide the uniting force. But the party itself is deeply affected by the inherent factionalism of Chinese politics. The glue that holds all of this together and which keeps China moving in basically the same direction is constant bargaining and consensus building. No decision, no policy in China is possible without a protracted process of bargaining and consensus building among jealous bureaucratic units and between centre, provinces and municipalities. Gaining cooperation and marshalling sufficient resources can only be achieved through a constant process of negotiating and renegotiating, of generating side bargains and sweetheart deals, of satisfying or mollifying all relevant interests. The distinguished sinologists Ken Lieberthal and Michael Oxenberg capture Chinese politics nicely when they write, and I quote, "China is held together by the formal structure of authority, by the networks of individuals bound by mutual obligations and loyalties who are embedded in the formal organisations, and by the total web of bargains among the hundreds of thousands of units which comprise the system," unquote. So the simplistic understanding of Chinese politics, of an authoritarian centre imposing its absolute will by diktat and force, couldn't be further from the truth. What is truly astounding is how such a factionalised and complex system of government has been able to hold 1.3 billion people together and move them all in the same direction down a path of breathtaking reform, and in the meantime lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Another common belief is that China is no longer a communist country. The best apparent evidence, we are told, came this year, when for the first time in history, a communist country had it within its power to destroy global capitalism. At the height of the global financial crisis, China could have sold its $763 billion in US Treasury bonds and finished off the global economy. Instead, Beijing did everything in its power to stabilise the system, including buoying the value of the greenback. While market reforms are fundamental to China's phenomenal success, to believe that China has embarked on the road to capitalism is to misunderstand what's actually happening. The state's control over exchange rates, the capital account, investment and infrastructure, energy pricing and development planning shows an economy that is a very long way from being capitalist. And neither are these temporary states of affairs soon to be abandoned along the inevitable road to capitalism. In a recent careful study published in Foreign Affairs magazine, Derek Scissors shows that the current administration of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao has reversed some of the pro-market reforms of the Jiang Zemin era. And listening to the thinkers within the Chinese Communist Party is even more sobering. They are in little doubt that history is on the side of socialism. According to these thinkers, it was Marxists who first foresaw globalisation. It is Marxist thinkers, according to them, who are best able to see and exploit its contradictions. The Chinese Communist Party is in little doubt that China is constructing socialism, that history is on China's side, and that Chinese socialism will bury capitalism. Probably the dominant popular conception of China is that of an economic superpower. Our own polling at the Lowy Institute just recently shows that a vast majority of Australians see China as the dominant economic power in Asia. People look at China and see several things. The factory of the world, the holder of $2 trillion of savings, double the size of America's debt. Almost every country's major trading partner. With 20 years of near 10% economic growth rates, China is seen to be the dynamo of the world economy. In reality, the Chinese economy is about 1/3 the size of California's. The image of China as the coming economic juggernaut is an extraordinarily powerful one. It is an image that China has become adept at using to its own advantage. No other country is so willing to use and so successful at using the terms of its bilateral relationships with other countries to exact what it sees as appropriate behaviour from them. China seeks, quote-unquote, friendly relations with all countries. But for Beijing, friendship entails clear obligations among its friends. No formal relations with Taiwan. Recognition that Tibet and Xinjiang are part of China. Not speaking too loudly about human rights. Not inviting in dissidents to talk about relations in China. Otherwise, according to Beijing, friendship is not apparent from the other side, and access and relations with Beijing become difficult. There are subtler shades to Beijing's shaping of its guanxi, its web of relationships with other countries. For example, China's deepest fear is that Washington will one day mobilise a coalition of countries to isolate, contain and economically strangle China. In response, in a remarkably short time, China has been able to inculcate a generalised belief in most other countries that the rest of the world cannot let China's economic miracle fail. To let China fail, it is broadly believed, would be to stall the global economy. Beijing has managed to gain universal, worldwide buy-in to China's economic success. And there are variations on this theme. At the height of the tensions over the negotiation of the iron ore price this year, Chinese negotiators reportedly said to their Australian counterparts, "We're saving the world economy and you're trying to stiff us on the iron ore price. What's going on?" But even given its current size, which belies current illusions about China's size, most economists now concur that on current growth rates, China will have the world's largest economy by the mid to late 2020s. The recent Goldman Sachs report suggests that China's economy will surpass that of the United States in sheer size by 2027. But even as the world's largest economy, China will have a per capita wealth of $12,688, around the same level as that of Uruguay and Iran today, and less than a third of the size of the current wealthy great powers per capita wealth, such as the United States, Great Britain, France. In other words, along with India, China will be the poorest great power in history. And this has important implications for how China behaves in the world.